1920s. This, oh man, if you could bottle up the 1920s and then just sprinkle it out every time you want a good time, here you go. I mean, there's some bad stuff too. There's good with the bad. That's how it goes. But the 1920s is going to be a whole new unit for us after the women's suffrage unit, and it's going to tie into a lot of different things. First, entertainment. You have jazz. You have movies. You have sports. And you have dance and dress and all of these different things that are coming into pop culture that we're going to learn and actually experience in our classroom. You're going to have the idea of rights, women's rights that we're just coming off the tail end, also racial rights, and also the rise of the KKK. Yeah, they're back, guys. It seems like every time there's something good, there's a nasty cloud of the KKK looming over it. You have then prohibition and then the crime world that we're going to talk about. And your paper's all about crime. It's about Capone. It's about the prohibition. It's about the selling of illegal alcohol. All this. And then you have this huge consumerism. What that means is people are spending mucho dinero, they're spending money like crazy. Why? Because of credit. They're buying stuff on credit. And the thing is, they're creating a giant economic bubble with all this credit. And all of a sudden it goes pop! And then bye-bye, and guess what we get to do? We get to go to the Great Depression, one of the worst economic times in the history of our country happens after this consumerism bubble pops. Let's get at it. History of alcohol and getting to the 18th Amendment. Let's talk about the mentality of Americans, because they passed an amendment, which means there was enough support in society and also in Congress and within the states to get rid of alcohol. So where does this come from? Well, the temperance movement pushes this, but really what it is it's alcohol. It seems to be accompanying all these other things. Alcohol by itself, not so necessarily bad. It's men spending the money on the alcohol. It's men being abusive to their families with the alcohol. It's prostitution that goes with alcohol. It's gambling that goes with alcohol. Alcohol is like the buddy to all these other things. So now what they have to do is, let's just take out the alcohol and these other things go away. Well, they were wrong. You see, when the 18th Amendment was passed, all those other things didn't go away. They actually increased. It becomes the vice of society. And that, we're going to do it now even more. This allows immigrants a job that they would normally not have, because now they can smuggle alcohol. They can make alcohol. They can sell alcohol. They can do things with alcohol. It gave positions to people like Al Capone, who's this come from nowhere immigrant who now is going to be literally the king of Chicago. He wasn't mayor, but he ran Chicago because he was this gangster who sold alcohol, gave people what they wanted, and it gives power to different types of people, and we're going to talk about the consequences of that later. So this is the mentality. Get rid of this, it gets rid of vice, but at the end of the day, it didn't get rid of the vice, it just amped it up on steroids. I want to talk about one guy, Wayne Wheeler. One of the coolest names, it's like a supervillain name. Wayne Wheeler's taking over the world. Wayne Wheeler was this guy who was a lobbyist that pushes for alcohol to go away with the 18th Amendment. But let's go back to his backstory. When he was younger, a farmhand gets drunk and stabs him with a pitchfork accidentally. And he's like, ow, you stabbed me with a pitchfork. And why does your breath stink so bad? What's going on, mommy? He's drunk. What? Alcohol can do this? Pitchforks and everything? And he's like, we need to do something about this. And eventually he starts listening to these speeches for people that are trying to get rid of alcohol. And he's like, this is going to be me. And he gets on his bike, no joke, and he's biking everywhere. He's like this guy who gets stuff done. He goes there, gets support for people that aren't supporting the 18th Amendment. He's like, why not? Tries to convince them otherwise. He gets this thing called pressure politics, where you would have people in the government that weren't too anti-alcohol, and he'd get them out. It was like this idea that you're not truly for this person. Well, if you're not too good for this, get him out. He doesn't belong in this party. That's what he would do. Eventually, he goes to Washington, D.C., becomes a lobbyist. A lobbyist is basically this guy or girl who goes to Washington, D.C., and tries to pressure politics or politicians to do things for specific industries or specific legislation. In this case, get rid of alcohol. And he succeeds. He gets the 18th Amendment, him and others, but he gets the 18th Amendment passed. Now it's in the Constitution, no more alcohol for anybody. But it goes further than that. You see, now he's a known name, and he can't go out there and enforce his rules, right? So you know who he turns to? Well, the KKK, of course, because those are a group of people you want to be associated with. But he turns to the KKK and goes, hey guys, I need your help. We had the 18th Amendment passed, but these people keep, drinking. That's a problem for me. So could you like go there and do your KKK thing and like destroy their businesses whenever you find them to like sell alcohol? The KKK's like, sure. And they would go in to bars and trash the place. They would tar and feather people. It's the KKK. They're not exactly nice people. So this is what happens. Eventually, he still doesn't like people drinking alcohol. And you're like, how are they getting the alcohol? Cleaning products back then had industrial alcohol, ethanol. Okay? And you can drink ethanol and you get a buzz from drinking these products back then. Don't try it now. Disinfectants kill you. They can get products back then that had ethanol in them. And now ethanol, when they would drink it, get a little buzz. Well, Wayne Wheeler didn't like that. So he told these companies, he had them change what was in the product. Instead of ethanol as the alcohol, they would also put in methanol, a poisonous chemical that when ingested would cause you to like throw up and have really bad it was bad news bears. Well, anyway, he doesn't tell the public. So all these people that are, drinking their cleaning utensils that have ethanol to get a little buzz, they take a swig, and they're like throwing up. Thousands of people go to the hospitals, hundreds die. Eventually they find out it was him that did it, and he scurries back to Michigan, where he dies like about a week later. No more Wayne Wheeler. The villain. I don't know. Wayne Wheeler. Just a good name. If you ever go to his comic books, pay attention. It's always 2 letters, same letters, like Peter Parker, okay? Bruce Banner, okay? Like, it's history. But anyway, Wayne Wheeler! History of how we get the 18th Amendment. Let's talk about a little about the history of alcohol, because alcohol has been around for some time. We talked about the difference between AD and BC. So BC, 7000 BC, that's when we first discovered that there was alcohol around. Basically, there were some pots that we discovered in Asia, and it had remnants of alcohol. It was the alcohol that was made was probably made with some rice, some grapes, and some honey. And that was like the first thing. And now we fast forward the tape a little bit, because when we get to Greece and Egypt, closer to Europe and Africa, then you're gonna have different types of alcohols there. Now, alcohol has 4 components. Okay, it's gonna have to have some grain. It's gonna have to have water. It's gonna have to have some yeast. It's gonna have to have some hops. You need all these things to actually do the process of fermentation. Fermentation is just organisms basically eating and producing different types of chemicals and some sort of output of a product. And in Egypt, they had more wheat, therefore they had more beer. That was what they sold, was beer, because they had more wheat. You need wheat to make beer products, barley. And then you need grapes to make wine, and the Greeks had more wine because they had tons more grapes. It had to do with the climate where they're at. So depending on what you use for your crop, is going to be a different type of alcohol that you're going to have. And alcohol wasn't just used for getting tipsy. Alcohol actually had beneficial purposes when it comes to medicine. It was a sanitary thing. And people who did voyages, pirates, or just shipping companies that would spend a long time at sea, they would use alcohol, not just to get drunk. They would use it to preserve their water, because if you're on a sailboat and you're on the ocean for a couple months and you have this big jug of water, what's going to happen to that big jug of water over time? Bacteria is going to grow, parasites are going to grow. That's bad news bears. What they would do is they take a cup or 2 of rum, put it in their water barrels. It would actually keep the thing pure for a longer period of time. So alcohol had its benefits. Now, yeast will die eventually, because yeast is these little organisms that go and they produce a bunch of stuff, the process of fermentation, and they'll actually die if the alcohol becomes too much. There's different percentages of alcohol you'll find in products. There's like 5%, 7%, 13%, 12%, 50%, whatever. There's different proofs of alcohol. Well, if the alcohol is too high, it'll kill the yeast and fermentation stops, and then boom, there's no more alcohol to be made. So what would happen is, humans, because we're inventful when it comes to stuff we enjoy, we made a way to actually distill, which I'll show you in class what this is, but to distill alcohol so you can actually get more alcohol or percentage of alcohol within each drink. That's why you have things like 20 proof, 30 proof, and so on. The further you go up, the more the alcohol is going to be, or more potent, therefore the more impact it's going to be on there. So that's kind of like the backstory of how alcohol becomes alcohol and a little bit of what makes alcohol alcohol. Let's talk about some terms you need to know. So 1, the speakeasy. The speakeasy is a term we're referred to in the 1920s as an underground saloon or bar. Basically, in order to get into speakeasy, you have to have the secret code. You have to be able to tell the bouncer, hey, I want 3 cherry Cokes. And they'd be like, oh, that's the code for the day. Come on into my saloon. And then that's how it worked. Now, the funny thing is, police officers in certain cities would go to these saloons, just hang out and get a drink, just depending on where you were. The other thing to keep in mind is the term bootlegger. A bootlegger is a rum runner. It's a person that's going to smuggle alcohol. Okay, that is terms we're going to use throughout 1920s to talk about alcohol. Now we got this out of the way. Let's get to crime. 1920. Portion is talking about gangs, like the gangs of the 1920s, right? The bootleggers, the Capones out there. We're going to talk about them. We're also going to talk about the gangs of the 1980s and 1990s during the crack epidemic. And the reason why is you're going to find something startling similar to this in so many ways, both in the prosecution, both in the handling of the particular drugs, whether it's alcohol or crack, the amount of money that's flowing, the reasons why people joined each gang. They're very, very similar. So we're going to talk about them together. So 1920s, you have the 18th Amendment, gets rid of alcohol. And what it does is it opens up an avenue for people who are poor to find jobs to make quick money. Was it dangerous? Absolutely. There was danger involved because there's shootings, there's death, there's police, they're going to arrest you and throw you away. All this stuff is true, but it offered you an opportunity to pay for your family's food on the table, luxurious house, like whatever. It was there as an opportunity for immigrants like Al Capone and others to grow in power, to get strength, and to have the capitalist dream of just having lots and lots of stuff. And this is going to be true during the 1980s and 90s of the crack epidemic. But the thing is, for the majority of people, it didn't work out so well. We'll talk about that too. So I want to talk about this idea. Did the 18th Amendment really stop anything? And a lot of people get down this very slippery slope of, well, you see, this law doesn't work because people still break it. Well, that's not what laws are there for. So when I'm saying that, this didn't stop alcohol, so we shouldn't have had prohibition, no, that's not a good argument because we have laws against murder and people still kill each other. That doesn't mean we get rid of the laws against murder. What you need to understand is laws are not there for 100% compliance. It's not there for everyone has to follow it because there's that people are going to break the laws. Laws are there as a protective element to also restitution for those people that are victims. I know that it's law against stealing, right? And there's a law against stealing. And we both know that people still steal. The reason why the law is there is not because we'll make sure that nobody steals ever. No law has ever been proposed with the idea of 100% compliance. It's there to protect the victim and also create punishments and hopefully rehabilitation for the person perpetrating the act. So if somebody steals, the reason why we have the law is now if they get caught, I get restitution if they steal my stuff. They're going to get a punishment by getting put away in jail or get a fine or whatever. There is restitution there. So that's why law is there. But this is the question. Did the 18th Amendment actually do its job in preventing people from drinking? No, it didn't. And let's talk about the consequences of this. First, I'm going to give you some statistics. Arrests and disorderly and drunkenness went up 41%. 41% jump. Drunken drivers went up 81%. Thefts and burglaries went up 9%. Homicides went up 13%. Police funding went up 11.4 million percent. Sorry, no, take that, not percent. $11.4 million, not percent. That would be ridiculous a lot. Just dollars, which is a lot of money. The number of federal convicts in our country during the 1920s went up 561%. That's not a typo. That's not a mistake out of my mouth. 561% went up in federal convicts. And finally, federal prison populations went up over 300%. So it really created a new system, and that was the ability for the police officers to arrest and the judges to convict and the prison populations to grow. And it also offered an opportunity for immigrants to make money. Not just immigrants, just people looking for money to make money. The reason why I'm saying immigrants because they were the ones treated the least among us during this time, and this is the way to have an avenue for getting there. The next video is all about what's happening in the 1980s, the 1990s, and can we compare and contrast what's happening in the 1920s. I want to talk about the gangs of the 1980s and the 1990s during the crack epidemic because understanding how those gangs worked compared to the gangs of the 1920s, you might get an idea of how the similarities will illuminate why these things even existed. So, like crack, alcohol was made illegal by the 18th Amendment. So crack is now illegal in the 1980s, okay? And not just crack, cocaine was. Now, what's the difference between cocaine and crack, and why would crack all of a sudden have this big boom? It has to do with the way it's made and who can use it. So, coke is typically used for rich families because coke is a very expensive drug, and you're not going to be able to sell this to poorer communities because it's just too much money. Not going to be able to do it. Not going to be able to do much with it. Now, what happened was they devised a way. I say people found a way to take coke and dilute it by cutting it with a base. So baking soda, infant formula, whatever. They cut coke with a base, and then what they could do is once they did that, when they cut it with a base, then you could smoke it rather than snort it. And there's the difference of how the drug impacts your body. This is like health 101 when it comes to drugs. Basically, with crack, when you smoke it, it gets into the lungs faster, and when it gets to the lungs faster, it means it gets the bloodstream faster. Therefore, the impact of the drug is fast. It doesn't do anything necessarily different to you other than making you go through the process of what coke does in a faster way because it's an inhalant. You're not storing it. It just goes so much faster. Now, when they do this, you have to understand you have like a thing of coke and you cut it with a baking soda or with infant formula or some sort of base. And what happens is that means you can take the big block of coke and you can separate into several more pieces of crack cocaine to which you can sell at a lower price, and it's highly addictive because it gives that rush quick, and the user wants to use it right away. Now, keep in mind with these two things, they do physiologically the same thing, just at different rates, and one of them, crack cocaine, is litigated towards. There's laws against that more. In other words, you will go to prison longer with that than with coke, even though it does the same thing, just faster rate. But anyway, they start selling this because they can make it cheaper. They can cut it, they can separate it faster, they can make it cheaper. So what happens is a bunch of gangs take advantage of this during the 1980s, inner city Chicago, New York, wherever, and it booms. And in the 1980s, there was a social scientist by the name of Sadir. And Sadir was trying to figure out how these gangs worked, like what they were about, what it was like to be in a gang. He's a social scientist. He wants to make a name for himself, but he also just wants to learn what's going on with the gangs. So Sadir goes into inner city Chicago, and it's one of the worst neighborhoods, not in Chicago, in the country. Like the highest death rate, like just the worst statistics you can think of. And he walks in there, and Sadir goes to this apartment complex, this building, and he hears voices in the stairwell. So he walks up the stairwell with a clipboard. Now keep in mind, back in the day, then during the crack epidemic, it was shoot first, ask questions later. But the clipboard probably saved his life. And a lot of this information I'm giving you, by the way, is in a book called Freakonomics, and I'd be glad to show you where to find this book. It's a wonderful book to read about just the economy of drugs in the crack epidemic. But anyway, so Sadir goes up in the stairwell, and there are 4 African Americans there, and they're rolling dice, playing dice. And Sadir wants to give them basically a questionnaire. And the questionnaire, the top question on the questionnaire basically says, how do you feel about being poor and African American in an inner city school or inner city in America? Probably not the best question to ask, especially since the options were like very good, good, bad, and very bad. And the gang wasn't too happy about this questionnaire they were just given, and they basically take him hostage. They take Sadir hostage, and they keep him overnight. And they're like, we're gonna wait till the gang leader shows up and he can deal with you. So he stays there overnight, discussing philosophy and hearing gunshots. And the gang leader shows back up and basically warns them, I'm gonna let you go. If you show back up, you're done. Sadir leaves, goes home, and you think that's the end of the story. It's not. Sadir goes back to the same complex and said, I had so much fun with you last night. I was wondering if I could spend some time with you. So Sadir hangs out with this gang, and this is how I am, and this is how we know some of the information about what I'm about to give you about gangs with the crack epidemic. So as he's there, he actually spends 10 years with this gang. They welcome him in. 10 years with the gang. He sleeps overnight in crack houses. His car gets shot up by rival gangs. He's eventually arrested, not for doing anything, but just being around people that were doing stuff. His computer was taken by the law enforcement. He is intertwined, and he starts looking at their books. And he starts seeing how gangs work financially, and they're a lot like McDonald's. And what I mean by that is, when you think gangs, the reason why people join gangs, and this is going to be similar when I talk about this later, they joined gangs back then for protection, to make money, to make better lives for themselves, to protect their family, by giving them money and protection. That's the financial gain of this is why they join the gangs. But when you start looking at the numbers, you start realizing that people in gangs don't make a lot of money, especially when you talk about the 1980s and 90s. And this is true also back during Capone's time. Think of it like McDonald's. You ever worked at McDonald's? I have. You'll know, well, if you pay attention, you'll know how money works. The average McDonald worker does not, think of like a pyramid, okay? The average McDonald worker is at the bottom part of the pyramid and they make very little, okay? Barely minimum wage. The top is like your CEOs, okay? Your store managers, those type of people. They make tons of money. Well, that's just like the gang. The average foot soldier, which was the majority of people in a gang, I mean, like the majority of the pyramid was the foot soldier, they made very little. And the people above them did make a little bit more, but to get to that position, you have to basically beat the odds to not be killed and to not go to prison, which were high likelihoods, and I'm going to get to the percentages in a moment. So one of the things that can narrow in this idea that the foot soldier didn't make a lot of money is a lot of foot soldiers, a lot of the gang members in Chicago at the time, and actually this is true now, they had a second job instead of being in the gang. They worked at a McDonald's or they worked at a fast food restaurant. So they had two jobs to make up for, the gang job that wasn't paying that well. Let me break down the numbers. So they actually have a board of directors in these gangs. They actually call themselves the board. And this is how the numbers break down. The average foot soldier back in the 1980s made $3.50 an hour. $3.50 an hour. Okay? That means that if you times that by 40 hours a week, times that by 52 weeks a year, they make in a year's time $7,000. That's how much they make. $7,000 in a year being a gang member, foot soldier. Taking amazing risk. Could die, could go to prison. There were three other positions after, actually going up, three other positions after the foot soldier. There was the local leader, who would make about $100,000 per year. Then there was the regional leader, which is $200,000 a year. And then you would have like the boss of bosses, the board of directors. They were making almost $500,000, $400,000 a year. You're like, that's a job I want. That's why I'm joining the gang. I want those. Well, hold your horses, because the majority of those positions are insulated. They're not going to go to prison, and they're less likely to get killed in that job because you have a ton of foot soldiers before you get to them. Well, I'll just kill the boss. Well, then you would have a bunch of people killing you. So it's one of those situations that it was like a hope and dream for those foot soldiers to make it to $100,000 a year, and the majority of them couldn't. They were stuck in that position of a foot soldier the rest of the career because they were going to die in that position or go to prison in that position, and maybe they get lucky and they would leave. That's very rare too. So understand that's like the payout. Now let's talk about death rate, because it's not just about the money, it's about the risks. And the death rate for a foot soldier was 7% per year. Okay, in an annual time, 7%, you had a 7% chance of dying. Now you're like, okay, that's bad. It gets worse per year because you actually have to add 7% every year that you do the statistic. So if I'm in a gang, my chance of survival is 7% this year. Next year, it's 14%. The third year, 21%. And the fourth year, 28%, which means in 4 years, I have over 1/4 of a chance of dying. Yeah. Now, as a comparison, you understand something. 7% chance of dying per year. A person on death row has a 2% chance of dying that year because there's a bunch of things that go into actually killing somebody on death row. You have a better chance of surviving through the year if you're on death row than working in an inner city gang. During the 1980s crack epidemic, 1990s crack epidemic. Another context of this is teens in Chicago during the 1980s crack epidemic had a 1% chance of dying. These are teens. These are just people living their life. 1% chance of dying. Now, bringing this all together, an Iraqi soldier in the most recent war in Iraq had a 0.5% chance of dying, which means, if you do your statistics, you actually had a greater chance of survival being on a battlefront in Iraq than being a teen living in inner city Chicago during the crack epidemic, and a significantly better chance of survival than being in the gang itself. This gives you an idea that there's an illusion of protection and money in these gangs. And by the way, similar statistics when we talk about gangs in the 1920s. So one of the things to keep in mind too is people in the gangs would fake their amount of money. They would lease cars. In other words, they would basically rent cars instead of buying them. They had gold-plated jewelry instead of actually gold jewelry. And they would actually give clips of money to kids, because when the kids spent the money, the kid owed the gang money. They become part of the gang, basically a servant. The reason why I'm talking about all this is because the gangs of the 1920s and the gangs of the 1980s have a similar buy-in. Both groups had bigotry towards them. So the gangs of the 1980s, there were African Americans dealing with a lot of bigotry during the time. It doesn't give them a right to be in a gang and sell drugs. I'm just saying this is what they were facing. Plus they were facing the dangers around them. They were sold illegal crack instead of illegal alcohol that you'd see in the 1920s. They had a high death rate, just like it was a high death rate in the 1920s gangs. There was a high, the bosses made tons of money while the foot soldiers made very little. Both is true for the 1920s gangs and the 1980s gangs. They both groups had people join for power, money, and protection. All three reasons were true for both cases. And finally, they both organized their gangs as a business. They had, franchises. They had supply and demand concerns. They were businesses. They just modeled after one thing: an illegal drug. Either it's illegal alcohol in the 1920s or illegal crack in the 1980s. These comparisons help us understand what's going on with the 1920s gangs. Let's get at it. For the next video, you're going to see me talk about Al Capone and all the things that he's doing in the 1920s.